On September 21, 1996, a 15-year-old girl drove to a fishing access site on the Gallatin River in Montana. By evening, she hadn't come home. Her mother drove out to the site, found her daughter's truck in the parking area with the keys and a water bottle lying on the trail nearby, and called police. Family friends found the girl's body later that night in a marshy area near the riverbank, under a willow tree. She'd been dragged there and hidden. Investigators recovered 4 male arm hairs from her body. None of them had roots. In 1996, a DNA lab couldn't read a hair without a root. They sealed the hairs into evidence bags and put them in storage. They stayed there for 28 years. Her name was Danielle Houchins. Everyone called her Dany. She was 15 years old and a sophomore at Belgrade High School, and a school of about 500 kids that served the ranching families in the Gallatin Valley. She lived in Belgrade, Montana, a small town of about 3,500 people 8 miles west of Bozeman. 1 high school, 1 main street, farmland and cattle ranches in every direction. Bozeman, home to Montana State University, was a 15-minute drive east. Dany loved the outdoors and the river. Her sister would say later that going out to the water by herself was just the kind of thing Dany did. On the morning of September 21, 1996, a Saturday, she'd had an argument with her family. She asked her mom for permission to drive out to the Cameron Bridge fishing access site on the Gallatin River to blow off some steam. Her mom said yes. Dany left the house around 11 a.m. wearing blue jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and a knee brace on her left leg from an injury she'd gotten a few weeks earlier, dancing with friends at a street dance. Cameron Bridge sits on the Gallatin River about 10 miles south of Belgrade on River Road. Gravel parking lot, boat launch, a footpath down to the water. The kind of spot that gets steady traffic on weekends during trout season and sits empty on weekday mornings. Dany parked her truck and walked toward the river. At some point that afternoon, a man attacked her and forced her face down into the shallow water until she drowned. The Gallatin County coroner determined drowning as the cause of death with evidence of sex. There were bruises on the back of her neck where someone had held her head down into the water. Her body was dragged from where she was killed and hidden under a willow tree in a marshy area away from the main trail. When Dany didn't come home that evening, her mother Cheryl drove out to Cameron Bridge. She found Dany's truck in the parking lot, unlocked and empty. The keys and a water bottle were lying on the trail just a few feet from the truck. That's when she knew something was wrong. She searched the area around the parking lot and the riverbank, but couldn't find her daughter anywhere. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and search and rescue were called in. They searched along the river and the trails leading away from the access point until it got too dark to keep going safely and had to stop for the night. Family friends went back out later and found Dany's body that night in the marshy area where she'd been hidden. She was under the willow tree, off the main trail, away from where anyone would have seen her from the parking lot or the riverbank. Deputies secured the scene and worked it through the evening and into the next day. The medical examiner's team collected biological evidence from Dany's body, including the 4 male arm hairs. They were sealed and stored at the sheriff's office in Bozeman. The Gallatin County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the Montana Division of Criminal Investigation worked the case together through the fall and winter of 1996. They interviewed dozens of people. They checked every vehicle that had been at the access site that day. The FBI ran the evidence through VYCAP, a national database that tracks patterns in violent crimes in case the killer had done this somewhere else. They went door to door through ranches and homesteads in the lower valley. They pulled receipts from gas stations along the route into Belgrade. They checked fishing license records for that weekend. They ran the state's sex offender database for anyone living within 50 miles and cross-checked those names against the vehicles from the parking area. Without a DNA profile from the hairs, they couldn't tie anyone to the crime scene. Numerous suspects were interviewed over the years, and all of them were ruled out through alibis, record checks, or DNA elimination samples. Tips came in from the public but led nowhere. Homicides committed by strangers with no connection to the victim are the hardest to solve because there's no relationship to trace, no motive to follow. The case stalled before the end of 1997. It stayed cold for years. Different detectives inherited the file over the decades, read through the original reports, checked the evidence in storage, and looked for angles that might have been missed. Each new detective brought fresh eyes but hit the same wall. The physical evidence was there, but the technology to read it wasn't. In 2005, the sheriff's office sent the hairs to the FBI lab in Quantico for mitochondrial DNA testing. Mitochondrial DNA can sometimes be read from a hair shaft without a root, but it only tells you about a person's maternal line. Thousands of people share the same mitochondrial sequence, so it can't produce a unique match. The results narrowed the ancestry, but weren't enough to name anyone. It was a step forward, but not the answer. The hairs were sent to the Montana State Crime Lab in Missoula several more times over the years, and the lab tried whatever extraction method was available at the time. Late 1990s, mid-2000s, around 2010. Each time, the answer was the same. A rootless hair was a dead end. The technology to read the nuclear DNA inside the shaft didn't exist yet. The hairs went back into storage every time, sealed in the same evidence bags, waiting for someone to invent a method that could pull genetic information from the trace material inside. Dany's sister Stephanie was 7 years old when her sister was killed. She grew up in Belgrade, stayed in the Gallatin Valley, and became the person who carried the case through the decades. She showed up at every meeting with investigators. She picked up every call from a new detective. On September 21st each year, the local papers ran an update on the anniversary, and Stephanie did the interviews, asking anyone with information to call the tip line. She never let the case drop out of public view. She grew up, got older than her sister ever got to be, and every year on that date, she sat with the weight of someone she'd barely had time to know. She'd been 7 when Dany was killed. She didn't have decades of memories to hold on to. She had a handful of years with an older sister and then a lifetime of September 21sts. In 2020, Stephanie connected with new detectives at the sheriff's office and demanded to see the full case file. They let her read the autopsy report for the first time. That's when she learned things the family hadn't been told in 1996. There were bruises on Dany's body, including on the back of her neck. Someone had held her head down into the water. There were injuries showing. There was semen in her underwear. She had scratched and fought back against her attacker. For 24 years, the full picture of what happened to Dany at Cameron Bridge had been sitting in a file that nobody showed the family. Stephanie pushed the sheriff's office hard to reopen the case after reading that report. The institutions that are designed to protect the rights of victims, to ensure that vicious killers are incarcerated, those institutions failed my sister, failed my family, and failed this community, she would say later. They did reopen it. The new investigation started in 2019 under Sheriff Dan Springer, and this time the family was involved from the beginning. Springer told reporters later that Dany's family was willing to reopen that wound and work side by side with his office to get to the truth. Stephanie had waited long enough. The new sheriff, Dan Springer, brought in outside help that his small department didn't have on its own. Tom Elfmont was a retired detective with decades of homicide experience on cold cases. Sergeant Court Depweg from California specialized in modern DNA work and had connections to forensic labs across the country doing advanced extraction that most state facilities couldn't touch. The three of them sat in the same room in Bozeman reading 28-year-old case files and deciding what to send to a lab. They went through every piece of evidence from 1996. The 4 hairs were the best chance at producing a suspect. Everything else had been run over the years and had led nowhere. Depweg connected the team with Astria Forensics, a California laboratory that had developed methods for pulling DNA from evidence other labs considered unusable. The 4 hairs were shipped from the Gallatin County Evidence Room to California in early 2024, packed carefully to prevent contamination after nearly 3 decades in storage. The lab used methods designed to break down the hair structure and release the trace amounts of DNA embedded inside the shaft. A rootless hair has DNA in it, but the amounts are microscopic. Older forensic equipment couldn't detect it at all. Standard labs would have looked at the sample and said there was nothing to work with. Modern sequencing technology can amplify those traces into a readable profile strong enough to search through ancestry databases. They pulled a profile from one of the 4 hairs in the spring of 2024. It was the first time in 28 years that anyone had gotten usable DNA from those hairs. The profile was run through the FBI's CODIS database first. No match came back. CODIS only finds people who've been arrested or convicted of a qualifying crime, and the killer had never been in the system. The profile was sent to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia for genetic genealogy work. Parabon's team uploaded it to consumer ancestry databases and found distant relatives who shared enough DNA to indicate a biological connection. From there, they built the family tree outward through birth records, marriage records, and census data across Montana and neighboring states. In May 2024, after weeks of tracing branches, the tree pointed to one man. His name was Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson. He was 55 years old, living in Dillon, Montana, a small ranching town about 100 miles southwest of Bozeman. Population around 4,000, 1 high school, 1 hospital, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. In September 1996, Hutchinson had been 27 years old and a student at Montana State University in Bozeman, studying fisheries and wildlife biology. He'd enrolled at MSU after growing up in Montana. His coursework took him to river access points across the Gallatin Valley for fieldwork, water sampling, and fish population surveys. Students in the program spent days at places like Cameron Bridge as part of their studies. The access site was a short drive south of campus on River Road. After graduating, Hutchinson took a job with the Bureau of Land Management in 1997 and moved from Bozeman down to Dillon. While he worked that federal job for 22 years, doing field work on public land across southwestern Montana, grazing permits, wildlife habitat, water monitoring. He got married. He had 2 kids who grew up in Dillon and went to the local high school. He had no criminal record of any kind in 3 decades, not even a traffic ticket. He retired in 2019 after his years of federal service and stayed in town. A woman who knew him for years told reporters she'd gone on fishing trips with him out in the middle of nowhere and never once questioned his character. His neighbors knew him as a quiet government employee with a family. Nobody in Beaverhead County had any reason to connect him to a crime 100 miles away. His name never came up in a tip, a lead, or an interview in 28 years of investigation. Investigators spent 2 months building their case after getting the name in May. They confirmed Hutchinson was enrolled at Montana State in September 1996 and had a Bozeman address that year. His coursework in fisheries biology would have taken him to the Gallatin River access sites regularly. Everything lined up. They just needed a direct DNA sample to confirm the match. On the evening of July 23, 2024, Tom Elfmont and Court Depweg drove 100 miles from Bozeman to Dillon to find him. They met Beaverhead County deputies at the local sheriff's office and drove together to Hutchinson's location. They told him they were investigating the death of Danielle Houchins. They had a body camera rolling during the interview. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Hutchinson sweated through his clothes. He scratched his face, and he chewed on his hand. His behavior got more and more erratic as the conversation went on. When they showed him a photograph of Dany from 1996, he slumped in his chair and wouldn't make eye contact. He wouldn't look at the picture. Elfmont would later tell reporters that he didn't need to ask Hutchinson directly if he'd killed Dany. The reaction told him everything. He didn't confess, and he didn't deny it. He sat through most of the interview in silence. He'd built an entire life in Dillon, a family, a federal pension, a quiet retirement in a small ranching town, and now 2 investigators were sitting across a table from him with a photograph of a 15-year-old girl, and they knew they didn't have enough to arrest him that night. Under Montana law, while they needed a direct DNA sample compared against the hair profile before they could file charges, they planned to get a court order for a cheek swab or collect something he'd touched in public. He was free to leave. He drove home to Dillon around midnight. At 4:17 the next morning, July 24, 2024, less than 8 hours after the interview ended, Hutchinson called the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office non-emergency line from his home in Dillon. He said he needed assistance and hung up without giving any details. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Dispatch logged the call and sent Beaverhead County deputies out to check on him. They found him on the side of a highway about 3 miles south of Dillon, at a gravel turnout off the road. He was dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 55 years old. It had been less than 8 hours since he'd sat across from 2 investigators who showed him a photograph of a 15-year-old girl and watched him refuse to look at it. Investigators collected DNA from Hutchinson's body during the autopsy performed by the state medical examiner. The sample was sent to the same California lab that had pulled the profile from the rootless hair. Lab technicians compared the 2 profiles side by side. The match came back at 100%. The hair found on Dany's body in 1996 belonged to Paul Hutchinson. The Gallatin County Attorney's Office confirmed that if he'd survived, the evidence supported charges of deliberate homicide and under Montana law. On August 8, 2024, 2 weeks after Hutchinson's death, Sheriff Dan Springer held a press conference in Bozeman and announced the 28-year-old case was solved. He walked reporters through the full timeline from September 1996 through August 2024. Dany's family was in the room along with other family members from across the Gallatin Valley. Springer credited Elfmont for his investigative work and Depweg for his DNA expertise. He noted that the technology that solved the case hadn't existed 5 years earlier and praised the family for never giving up. Stephanie stood at the podium. "After nearly 28 years without answers, without justice, we celebrate today," she said. She addressed the people of Montana directly. "Danielle's story should anger you," she said. "Should make you think about your mothers, your sisters, your wives, and your daughters. It should make you think about everything you would do to protect and honor the women you love." Hutchinson had no connection to Dany or her family. He was a stranger who happened to be at Cameron Bridge on a Saturday morning in September 1996. Investigators called it a crime of opportunity. A 27-year-old grad student encountered a 15-year-old girl alone at a fishing access site on the Gallatin River and attacked her. Then he drove home to Bozeman, finished his semester, graduated, took a federal job 100 miles away, and raised a family. He spent the next 28 years living as the person nobody suspected. His wife released a statement after the press conference through the funeral home in Dillon. She said the family was heartbroken by what they'd learned and that their hearts went out to the Hutchins family. She said the wife and children had no knowledge of any crimes committed before the investigation found them and were trying to figure out how to move forward with their own lives. The only things that connected Hutchinson to Dany were 4 hairs in an evidence box that nobody could read for 28 years. Law enforcement said after the press conference that they were still looking into Hutchinson's life and possible connections to other unsolved cases in the region. Dany Hutchins went to Cameron Bridge that Saturday morning because she'd had an argument with her family and wanted to cool off at the river. She was 15 years old. She was wearing blue jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and a knee brace from a dancing injury. The man who killed her drove home to Bozeman and built a life for himself. 28 years later, and a hair from his arm told investigators who he was. If you enjoyed this case, go check out the other solved cases in the playlist.